Please welcome President of Eco Northwest, John Topogna.
All right. So how are we doing? Excellent. Well, you should be. Now look at this. Longest expansion in U.S. history. No American cohort before you has ever experienced an 11th year of an economic expansion. And that's what you're doing exactly this morning. Here's all of the recession or expansions going back to World War II. I checked all the way back to the Franklin Pierce administration. I couldn't find anything longer, so we'll call this the longest. Now, Oregon typically thrives during economic expansions, and this one is no different. We have lots of good news to share, and we had a great decade, but we also had a couple of big pieces of unfinished business and missed opportunities I want to talk about. But I'm going to start with the good news. You'll remember we started this decade with a goal of 25,000 jobs a year. We created nearly 50% more than that over the course of this decade, and there were great examples all over the state. The recovery really started in Hillsboro, when Intel pulled out these gigantic cranes, including the one that doesn't even fit on the slide. It's the biggest crane in the world. And they started their D1X initiative, a three-phase project that's lasted over the course of the entire decade. They've employed thousands of construction workers, expanded their permanent staff, and more importantly, they have cemented Oregon as their headquarters for the future of research and manufacturing. Yay to Intel. You only have to drive a few miles down Highway 26 and you come here to the newly expanded Nike campus. 6 new buildings on the Nike campus, including this one. This is the LeBron James building, and it's the center of their innovation. It's filled with scientists and engineers, nanotechnology, and I'm told sweating copper mannequins. So incredible stuff going on the Nike campus. Head into downtown Portland, and we've had a great run there. We have expanded our technology outside of electronics and into software with both homegrown startups and big technology companies coming into the state to use our high-quality workforce. If we hop over the mountains into central and eastern Oregon, those big tech companies have grown fond of our climate, our reliable energy, and our high-quality workforce coming out of our community college system to operate and maintain their data centers. And it turns out the Columbia River region is also one of the best places in the world to develop and test drones, as the U.S. Senator just said, and thanks to the 2 U.S. Senators, we just got an investment from the federal government to expand and maintain that Eastern Oregon airport where a lot of this testing goes on. If you folks haven't been to Eugene recently, check out the progress here. This is the new Hayward Field. It's going to serve 2 purposes. It's the headquarters of Tracktown USA, but it's also a showcase of mass timber and wood products innovation. And we've got a lot of good news in the food and beverage sector. I'll start with our brewmasters. This is Breakside Brewing in Slabtown, Portland. 59 gold medals earned by Oregon brewers over the course of the last decade at the Great American Beer Festival. 3 by Breakside, 8 by a brewery in Baker City, Oregon. That's called punching above your weight. Here we go. And the New York Times loves our wine industry. They wrote this their wine critic wrote this in 2017. Nowhere else does the level of quality seem so high, the perspective so diverse, and the experimentation so fierce as it is in Oregon right now. And if you're headed to the East Coast, I've got good news for you. You can get Tillamook cheese there in Manhattan and up and down the eastern seaboard. So if you see Patrick Kreitzer, tell him thank you for that. And you may have noticed in October that the Rogue Creamery with Rogue River Blue beat out 3,200 cheeses from 42 different countries to be declared the best cheese in the world. Now, how about that? Now, I could go on for 15, 20 more minutes about good news, but Duncan didn't give me that much time, so I'm going to move on to more charts. Second big goal for the Oregon Business Plan is trying to get the per capita income up to the U.S. average. Per capita income is all the income divided by all the people, and I'm comparing it to the U.S. here. You can see we started the decade at an all-time low, 89% relative to the U.S. Our incomes have grown faster over this expansion. We've gotten up to 93.5% by 2018. That's good, but not great. The good part is it has fueled the third best state revenue recovery in the country. You can see we're up 30% in inflation-adjusted terms relative to our previous peak, and that's done wonders for public services. We've gone from a below-average K-12 school spending state to get back up to the U.S. average at about $12,000 per student. This state revenue also helped us come up with our share of funding the Affordable Care Act. Some of you know that as Obamacare. Our uninsured rate has fallen from 17% in 2010 to 7% in 2018. And good for that one. And we didn't even spend all the money. If you look at October, and you look at our two major reserve programs, the Educational Stability Fund and the Rainy Day Fund, we have $1.3 billion in them. The third indicator is poverty. We want to get it down below 10% by 2020. It's headed in that direction. We crested at 18%. We're above the U.S. average. We're now probably a little bit below the U.S. in poverty. Good news from Josh Lerner at the Office of Economic Analysis. He says in looking at poverty for communities of color, they're at multi-decade, if not historic lows, but those racial poverty gaps are still too big, and there's more work to be done. So let's take stock. The expansion checklist, 37,000 jobs per year, incomes growing faster than the U.S. average, third best state revenue recovery in the country, and poverty declining. You would think this would be the point where the confetti would come out of the ceiling, and we'd all just celebrate, and I'd stop this presentation. But then I talked to John Horvick at DHM Research, and he tells me that 44% of Oregonians think the state's on the wrong track. 44% of Oregonians think the state's on the wrong track. Longest economic expansion in U.S. history. Some people think taxes are too high. Some people think taxes are too low. There's a lot of concern about our public pension system, and nobody in Portland likes the traffic. I'm going to talk about a couple of other issues. First, housing. We built 63 housing units between 2010 and 2016 for every 100 new households formed during that period. If you underbuild to that extent for that long, you put upward pressure on rents, and that's exactly what's happened. 153,000 low-income households spending more than half of their income on rent. That's an impossible budget. You can't make that work, and you are one accident away, a job loss, an unforeseen medical bill, a bout of domestic violence, from losing your home and ending up on the street or in a temporary shelter or living out of your car. And we have 14,000 of our neighbors who are in that condition on any given night. So we have moral and economic imperatives to work hard on this housing affordability and homeless crisis in the state. The good news is that the legislature passed what many national experts are calling the most important housing reform in the country. Speaker Kotek's going to be talking about it with Cordo Hayward this afternoon, right after the governor's speech, so stay for that. Second big missed opportunity of this decade, this unprecedented decade of expansion, is the lack of progress on our 40-40-20 educational goal. You may remember in 2011, the legislature formally established this goal of having 40% of young Oregonians have a bachelor's degree or better, 40% with some kind of post-secondary experience. It might be an industry certification, a certificate, an associate's degree, etc., and that 20% of Oregonians would have no less than a high-quality high school diploma. That was the goal. I could go on for a half an hour talking about education data, but I'm just going to focus on two numbers to be brief. Let's look at the college-going rates among high school graduates. In 2010-11, 65% of our high school graduates went on within a year and a half to attempt to access post-secondary education. In 2016-17, that number was 64%. I'm going to be real simple here. If our goal is 80%, we're never going to get there if 64% are getting access to begin with. And some of you might come to me and say, 80% is too ambitious. It's an overreach. And to you, I would say, stick around after this morning break and listen to the panels on the future of work and tell me whether the education outcomes of the past make any sense for this current generation going forward. So I'm going to stop my piece of this presentation here and revisit my question. The question was, how are we doing? But the theme of this summit is the long game. And if we're really interested in the long-term outcomes for Oregon, a more appropriate question would be, how are they doing? And the answer to that question is, not nearly as well as they should be doing. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my partner here, David Williams. He is the Policy Director of Opportunity Insights. He spends all of his time thinking about long-term outcomes for kids. He was a colleague of Dr. Raj Chetty. If you were here at last year's summit, you might remember Raj Chetty beamed in from Cambridge, Massachusetts, and talked about their groundbreaking work on economic mobility. This last summer, Dr. Chetty signed a memorandum of understanding with Governor Kate Brown to focus some of Opportunity Insights' attention and research on Oregon. And so please welcome David Williams. He's going to give us an update on that early work.
John, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. One more time. Good morning, everyone. That's okay. We'll work on that, though. But thank you very much for having me. Once again, my name is David Williams. I serve at Opportunity Insights, and we are a research and policy lab founded by Dr. Raj Chetty, based at Harvard University. And I don't spend all my time thinking about these issues, but I do spend most of it thinking about these issues, and especially focusing on how we can use data and research to not just think about these issues, but really have impact, to partner with communities to think on how we can change policies in ways that can really support our young people. And so, to start, why is this research important? Before serving Opportunity Insights, I served in the mayor's office in Detroit, Michigan, as a senior advisor to Mayor Duggan, just as we were entering into the largest municipal bankruptcy in United States history. It's a city that lost over 1 million people over the past 50 years. And over the past 15 years, 1 in every 3 homes was lost through tax foreclosure. So a community that looks very different than Portland and Oregon, but I think there's something instructive there. Because we were focused on trying to stabilize and revitalize our city. And through tireless and targeted work of many, we began to see progress. City services were being provided in a consistent manner. Abandoned homes and blight, we were getting rid of them. And we started to see resources and investment coming back into our neighborhoods. But it raised a very important question. As we're starting to see this progress, is it really improving the quality of life of our most vulnerable families? And is it impacting the life outcomes of their children, our children? And that's a question at the root of what we think about at Opportunity Insights. And what we've seen is that intergenerational mobility, economic opportunity, has become fleeting for many. In the 1940s, for individuals born in that decade, the American dream, the idea of moving up the income ladder, of earning more than your parents, was a guarantee. But that has faded dramatically. So much so that in the 1980s, that guarantee has become a 50-50 proposition of rising up the income ladder. And in many ways, that feels like it's at the core of a lot of the political and cultural frustration that we see today. So how do we reverse those trends? But we also see that economic opportunity varies across geography. So using IRS data and Census Bureau information, we're able to follow the long-term outcomes of 20 million children born in the 1980s and looking at their outcomes into adulthood. And what we see is that these areas of blue in the Great Plains and on the coast have very high rates of mobility. Kids who are growing up in low-income families that make around $27,000. In some of these regions are on average making upwards of $40,000. Mobility rates higher than any country that we have data for. But you look at the Rust Belt and in the Southeast, and on average, low-income kids who grow up there grow up and remain low-income adults. So what's behind that? Of course, as you all know, a strong economy and job growth are the bedrock of a prosperous community, but we've seen the data that job growth isn't everything. When we compare job growth to our measure of economic mobility, we don't see much of a correlation, right? So communities like Charlotte and Atlanta, communities that have grown tremendously over the past 20 years, have some of the lowest rates of economic mobility in the country. So in a place like Uptown Charlotte, new jobs at Bank of America and Wells Fargo are great for the people who are moving to Charlotte. But the kids who grow up there, especially those low-income and middle-income kids, they aren't able to take advantage of those opportunities. So really thinking about, as we attract new business, growth, and development, how do we make sure that the kids who are just down the road are able to tap into their potential and those opportunities? Right? What are the human capital supports that we need to really make opportunity available to all in our communities? One issue we can look at in the data that does have real impact is race. So that same chart I showed looking at mobility rates across the country, now we're looking at upward mobility rates for black men compared to white men. And one thing to note is that these two maps are on the same color scale. And what that means is that the best places in terms of outcomes for black men growing up in low-income families are still worse than the worst places for white men. So men growing up in the same communities, in the same cities, even in the same neighborhoods, we're seeing these disparate outcomes. So when we think about all the important work we're doing, we must keep in mind how our communities are impacting different groups of people. So thinking about discipline in schools, the criminal justice system, employment discrimination, how do we tackle all these issues and think critically around how they impact the work that we're doing on a day-to-day basis? So with this research, what are the next steps? Right, we have this MOU, we've been working with folks in your community. How do we translate the research to policy? How do we inform what we're doing with data and research? We think of this in three broad ways. A lot of our applied research focuses on these issues. One is pushing back on the history of segregation. How do we, especially for low-income families, increase their ability to choose where they want to live and choose neighborhoods where they will thrive? Two, how do we invest more effectively in our neighborhoods and support them holistically? And three, how do we improve higher education to really serve all kids in our communities? So as we see across the country, there's not just an affordable housing shortage, but in many ways, our affordable housing strategies have perpetuated the same history of residential segregation that I think is behind some of these fading trends in economic mobility. So beyond just producing more units, how do we ensure that those units are created equitably across the region and across the state? How do we ensure that low-income families have access to affordable units in neighborhoods where they will thrive, where the data shows that their children will have a better chance at upward mobility? So leveraging the low-income housing tax credit, other affordable housing mechanisms, and housing choice vouchers, how do we create more access in a way that can really help integrate our communities and create healthier neighborhoods for all of our kids? Two, we can use the data to start to figure out what is it that creates healthier communities. So Oregon's already made significant progress in K-12 funding, but something we see in the data is that the communities that surround and bolster our schools are vital. More economically diverse communities, where there's more social capital and neighborhood cohesion, we see that has a tangible impact on outcomes for the kids who live there. We're working with the Oregon Community Foundation to see what's happening in a positive direction in neighborhoods throughout Oregon, to see what lessons we can learn to help us invest more effectively in creating more stable communities that can really serve as springboards for economic mobility. Higher education. Colleges and universities can even the playing field. We see it in the data. However, at many schools, there's very low access for the low-income students in our communities. So for example, looking at Oregon State and University of Oregon, less than 5% at students at these schools are coming from low-income families. And this is significantly lower than other big public schools on the West Coast. So how do we create access to schools like that and other schools that we consistently see are able to push low-income students into the middle class and beyond? Right? What policy levers can we move? Because college and university is a very strong pipeline from our neighborhoods, from our communities, and helping push kids into stable careers and stable adulthood. So to reverse these trends we see with the American dream won't be an easy task. It takes hard work. It'll take political will and real collaboration across sectors. And big data is not a magical solution, but it can help us ask the critical questions more precisely and ensure that we're focusing on those issues that'll have real impact and can be tracked in a real, measurable way. Very happy to continue this collaboration, and thank you for having me today.